It has now been over 2 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, longer than a lot of people would have thought this war would be going on. Even though Ukraine has held its ground and remained the underdog in the fight, the country is still in desperate need of continued support from NATO and beyond. So is this support dwindling as the war enters its third year, or will Ukraine be left to fight on its own? Joining me now to discuss this is former British Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, thank you so much for your time today. To kick off, one of the major donors, the United States, obviously Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban said this week that Donald Trump told him that if he were re-elected in November, he would not give a penny to Ukraine. The Biden administration has directed at least $75 billion in assistance towards Ukraine since the war began. If Trump were to stop this, how dire would the situation be?
Well, the bottom line, it would be very dire indeed. I mean, the US is the most powerful military country in the world without a shadow of the doubt. And if Trump did withdraw US support, there are two important aspects to consider here. First of all, the physical military capability that the Americans are providing, the ammunition, the smart munitions, the equipment like Abrams tanks, and others, which are hugely significant. It is also the American intelligence. It's probably only the CIA and the UK's MI6 intelligence service that is really deep into Russia and getting a lot of intelligence out. So physically, if the US pulled back, if Trump pulled them back, that would have a huge impact. The other element to it is the psychological impact. The US has bolstered NATO really for many, many years and has really been the glue that has held it all together. So if Trump steps back, then physically and psychologically, that should have a huge impact. Having said that, only yesterday, Sweden, a very, very powerful, very capable military, joined NATO. We also had Finland join a year ago. So with the NATO European-based armies now more powerful, that if the US stepped back, I expect it wouldn't be quite as disastrous as it would have been before the start of this war. But yeah, let's not be in any shadow of doubt. If Trump pulls the plug, it is going to be very, very much more difficult. And quite frankly, is going to make a third world war, particularly war in Europe, more likely rather than less likely.
Well, if the US does back out, or either at least, reduces significantly the funding, could this create a trickle effect leading NATO and other countries doing the same?
I think most of the other European countries, because the war is so close to them. I mean, it was interesting only yesterday, the former head of the German spy agency said that the German people needed to really wake up to the threat of Putin on the doorstep. And it's probably the same in this country too. People are far more concerned with the cost of living crisis, with immigration and climate change, than actually with war in Europe. But it's war in Europe that is the most likely, certainly in the short term at the moment, that we should be focusing on. So I think that the support to Ukraine will certainly hold up this year. However, there are elections coming up in this country at the end of the year, and certainly defense is not a leading issue in the election. We've seen President Macron of France making some pretty strange statements recently. I mean, he has suggested that NATO should consider putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, which is, quite an extraordinary statement for somebody who at the beginning of this war was appeasing Putin. He now seems to have gone full 180 degrees. But I think, again, it's about elections. And I think most of what Macron is saying at the moment is for his own electorate. But yeah, I think at the moment, Europe will hold firm. They know they have to, because if Ukraine does not prevail, if Putin takes Ukraine, there is nobody who looks at these things seriously, thinks that he's going to stop there. He'll be into Latvia and Lithuania, before we know it. So I think, and I hope that the Europeans and us here in the UK realize that this is an existential fight. And if we don't get it right now, we could all be fighting our own boots on the ground in Europe before we know it.
Well, yeah, going back to what Emmanuel Macron said, he said obviously allies shouldn't be cowards and should be ready to join combat by sending soldiers to fight in Ukraine, boots on the ground, as you say. But is that not what Ukraine needs?
Well, I think it's something that we shouldn't discount. I think too many countries, including the UK, after Macron said that a few days ago, said no, we're not going to put boots on the ground. I think Putin needs to believe that actually the UK and other European countries may well put boots on the ground in Ukraine. Because if we discount it immediately, that really gives the advantage back to Putin. What the Ukrainians really need at the moment is, dare I say it, boots in the air. It's all about air power. If Ukraine can get air superiority, it'll allow its ground forces to be far more effective. So if Mr. Macron is suggesting French fighter jets and French fighter pilots over Ukraine, then I would certainly support that. And I would support other European countries doing likewise.
Going back to the amount of money that is being given to Ukraine, and if Trump is re-elected in November, why would the United States want to give Russia the opportunity to completely infiltrate Ukraine, to be able to flex its power, if Russia is such a threat when it comes to a nuclear war looming?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question, but I think one has to really look at Trump and what he represents. Trump is all about America. And it's America first, and Trump is very inward looking. So I think he feels that he can sit safely across the other side of the pond, sat in America with his vast army, and be protected from Putin. As far as the nuclear piece goes, Trump knows that the US and Russia have parity in the nuclear conflict zone. So it is, I think it's very unlikely that Putin will use nuclear weapons. And I think it's reassuring the fact that over 2 years down the line, despite the fact that Putin's threatened nuclear weapons, on a weekly basis, he hasn't used them because he knows that would be the end of it. That's 75 billion not coming to support Ukraine, which means, what Trump has been saying all along is the European countries need to do the heavy lifting in this area. And, I agree with Trump on very, very few things, but I do agree with him that a lot of European countries are not spending enough on their own defense and hitherto have relied on the US and others to protect them.
I mean, you can understand if you're an American voter how bizarre you would find it that the Biden administration or any US administration in that regard spends so much on this kind of support to other countries when European countries are not even spending as much money on their own defense when they're sitting on the doorstep of Russia and Ukraine, and the United States is all the way over the other side. It's always the United States spending the most money when it should be, as you said, it should be the countries in the surrounding areas. But back on Trump, he claims to be this intimidating leader for world dictators, but critics would argue that the language he uses almost cozies up to the likes of Putin and Kim Jong-un. But, he has, the way he's worded certain things, it does look like he praises them. But if assistance to Ukraine is cut off, what would that look like to Putin? Would he feel like he was, playing the United States quite well?
Yeah, no, I think so. Absolutely. I mean, Putin has said some strange things, and Trump has said some very strange things. He actually thinks a couple of things Putin has done has been good. He even said a few things that Hitler did. So I think we have to, but he says a lot of things for effect without necessarily thinking of the second and third order consequences here. But we must realize, an awful lot of people in the States who seem to want to vote for Trump, rarely go out of their own states, let alone outside their own country. So, to them, Europe seems, a different world, almost a different planet. And we must take account of that. And we have perhaps relied too much on the US since the end of the Second World War and during the Cold War for peace in Europe. And it is time now that we plan to not have the US there to protect us in Europe, which means all countries, including the UK, must look very hard and fast at their defensive capabilities and see if they're enough. And if they're not enough, they need to invest in it, because we are really in a 1939 moment with another tyrant heading west across Europe. And there is no way we want to get into another 6-year war in Europe. I'm sure it wouldn't happen. It wouldn't last that long anyway. But that is a distinct possibility. Ideally, everybody wants Ukraine to prevail and kick the Russians back whence they came. But that is the best option. We need to also plan for the worst option. And the worst option is the Russian hordes heading west from Ukraine. And then that means that the British military, the French, the Germans, the Low Countries, and the Scandinavians will be fighting the Russians in Europe. Hopefully that won't come to it. But Putin only recognizes strength. And he then, if he sees weakness, he'll then exploit it. And there are some countries in Europe that are showing weakness on the military front, and that needs to be shored up. And I put the UK in that bracket as well, because there is a possibility, maybe not today, maybe not next month, but in the next, 6 months to a year or so, where we could find ourselves fighting the Russians. And we must plan now for that worst case eventuality.
It's really interesting. Hamish, last month, Pope Francis said in an interview that Ukraine should actually have the courage to wave the white flag and enter into negotiations with Russia. Now, that is a bizarre statement for a lot of people to read. What did you make of that comment? Is that another way of saying that Ukraine needs to give up?
Well, I think that's an extraordinary comment. And, I am sure the Pontiff does a lot of very good work. And, he should perhaps stick to his religious activities and his support in that area. Comments like that are incredibly unhelpful and really aiding and abetting Putin rather than supporting the Ukrainians. It's true that Putin apparently is some sort of Christian in some form or other. Not quite sure which particular god he follows. I can't believe it's the same one that the Pope follows too. But I think this is a case where actually, the Pope, for all the very good he does, should stay out of these sort of arguments, particularly if he's going to make inflammatory statements like that, because actually that has put more petrol on this fire rather than dampened it down. So I think really unhelpful, ill-advised, but unfortunately, I expect his advisors probably don't really understand the military and political situation that is happening in Ukraine and in Europe at the moment. That's why, he should stick to handing out communion and doing good things rather than perhaps trying to get involved in a war that perhaps he doesn't completely understand.
Hey, Mr. Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure.